Story 1. The three-note whistle on Bell Ridge. Location: Webster County, West Virginia. Approximate year: 2009. The third time the whistle came from the trees. It copied our foreman's signal perfectly. 3 short notes, a pause, then 1 long note. The problem was, Rick was nearly 20 miles away, and his orange plastic whistle was hanging from a nail, less than 6 feet from where I was standing. This happened in October of 2009, when I was 29 years old. At the time, I worked for a small environmental surveying company out of Charleston, West Virginia. Most of our jobs were ordinary. We mapped access roads, marked wetlands, checked erosion near power lines, and documented anything that might delay construction crews. That fall, a utility company hired us to survey an old transmission corridor running through a remote section of the Monongahela National Forest. The corridor had not been properly maintained in decades. Part of it followed an abandoned logging road. Another section crossed land that had once belonged to a coal company. A small settlement had stood on Bell Ridge until the early 1960s. Maybe 50 or 60 people had lived there at its busiest. By the time we arrived, almost nothing remained. We found sections of stone foundation, rusted pipe, broken bottles, and 1 brick chimney standing alone among the trees. The nearest occupied house was more than 9 miles away. There were 4 people on our crew. Rick was our foreman. He was in his late 40s and had worked outdoors for most of his life. Luis operated the compact excavator we used to clear fallen trees and deepen drainage ditches. Dana was a wildlife technician contracted to document protected species. I handled the GPS equipment, maps, and most of the measurements. We set up camp in a wide clearing that had once served as the settlement's equipment yard. There was enough level ground for 2 canvas tents, a small enclosed utility trailer, Rick's old Ford F250, and a white company pickup assigned to Luis. Our nearest water source was a creek about a 1/4 mile downhill. We had a generator, a propane stove, battery lanterns, and several Motorola radios. On our first afternoon, Dana found fresh bear tracks near the creek. She mounted 1 digital game camera there, then attached another to a tree at the northern edge of the clearing. That camera faced the old brick chimney and part of the abandoned road. For the first 5 days, nothing unusual happened. We left camp shortly after sunrise and spent most of each day cutting through mountain laurel, marking culverts, and checking the condition of old wooden poles. The work was tiring, but simple. The weather stayed cold and damp. Fog settled between the ridges every morning, and by afternoon the ground smelled of wet leaves and decaying wood. We heard coyotes at night. Luis spotted a bobcat crossing the old road. Dana's cameras captured several deer, a raccoon, and the rear half of a black bear. Everything felt normal for that part of West Virginia. Rick carried an orange plastic whistle on a black cord. Whenever we spread out along the transmission corridor, he used it to call us back. 3 short notes meant return to the vehicle. 3 short notes followed by 1 long note meant there's a problem. He had used the same signals for years. On our 6th morning, the weather radio warned that a strong line of storms would reach the county by evening. Heavy rain was expected, along with possible flooding in the lower valleys. Rick wanted to finish checking 2 culverts before the storm arrived. We worked until early afternoon. On the way back, the excavator blew a hydraulic hose. Then after we reached camp, the generator began cutting out every few minutes. Neither problem was serious by itself, but water had already started flowing across one of the low sections of the access road. Rick decided that he and Luis would take the company pickup into Webster Springs for a replacement hose, fuel, and a new spark plug for the generator. They would also call our office and report the condition of the road. Dana and I were supposed to stay behind and secure the equipment. Rick expected to be back before dark. Before leaving, he pointed toward the creek. "If the water passes the second marker, move everything into the trailer," he said. "Don't wait for us." Then he removed the whistle from his neck and hung it on a nail inside the trailer. "Won't need this in town." That detail matters. I remember the orange plastic, the black cord, and the quiet tapping sound it made against the metal wall. Rick and Luis left at about 3 in the afternoon. For the next 2 hours, Dana and I covered the equipment, tightened the tent lines, and moved the fuel cans uphill. The storm arrived earlier than predicted. The wind came first. It moved through the forest in long waves, bending the tops of the hemlocks. Then the temperature dropped, and rain began hammering the trailer roof hard enough to drown out normal conversation. At around 5:30, the generator stopped completely. I removed the spark plug, cleaned it, and tried starting the engine again. Nothing. We still had battery lanterns, so we decided to leave the generator alone until Rick returned. At 6, I called him on the radio. There was no answer. The ridges often blocked the signal, so I was not worried yet. Dana heated canned soup on the propane stove while I checked the creek. The water had risen, but it remained below Rick's second marker. By then it was getting dark. The rain weakened, but fog began moving into the clearing. It rose from the lower ground and settled between the trees until the forest beyond our lantern looked like a flat gray wall. We ate inside the utility trailer with the side door open. At 7:15 we heard the first whistle. 3 short notes came from somewhere north of camp. I set down my spoon. "That's Rick." Dana looked toward the open door. "Why wouldn't he use the radio?" I picked it up. "Rick, this is Matt. We heard you. Come on in." Only static answered. We waited. The whistle did not repeat. I assumed Rick and Luis had parked somewhere along the road and were walking in because of the mud. I put on my rain jacket, took a flashlight, and went to the edge of the clearing. "Rick!" No response. The fog reflected the flashlight beam back into my face. I could see the first row of trees, and nothing beyond them. Dana came outside behind me. For almost a minute we stood there listening. No approaching footsteps, no engine, no voices. There was only the sound of water moving through the creek below us. Then the radio in my hand crackled. 3 short whistle notes came through the speaker. Dana stared at it. Can a radio pick that up? If someone's holding the transmit button. But who? Through the open trailer door, I could still see Rick's orange whistle hanging on the nail. I told myself that Luis might have another whistle. Or Rick might know how to whistle with his fingers. There were reasonable explanations. What I could not explain was why neither man answered us. We returned to the trailer and closed the door. By 9, the creek had risen almost to the second marker. We moved the remaining food, sleeping bags, and equipment cases inside. Shortly afterward, the rain stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the storm. Water ticked from the roof. Somewhere near the door, a heavy drop fell at regular intervals. Dana sat on a folding chair with a blanket around her shoulders. I stood near the small front window, watching the fog. That was when we heard footsteps near the tents. Crunch. A pause. Crunch. Whatever was moving outside was crossing wet gravel and fallen leaves. The steps were slow and heavy. I picked up the radio. "Rick?" The footsteps stopped. A moment later, the canvas wall of the nearest tent pressed inward, then slowly returned to place. Dana whispered, "That's not them." I wanted to tell her she was wrong. Before I could speak, the whistle sounded again. This time, it came from directly behind the trailer. 3 short notes, a pause, then 1 long note. Rick's emergency signal. Dana and I both looked at the orange whistle hanging on the nail. Neither of us spoke. I switched off the main lantern. We left 1 small flashlight on the floor, pointed away from the windows. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then something touched the outside wall. A slow scraping sound traveled along the metal siding. It began close to the ground. As it moved toward the rear corner, the sound rose higher. By the time it reached the back of the trailer, it was level with my head. Then it continued upward. Dana pressed 1 hand over her mouth. The scraping stopped near the roof. We waited in the darkness. I became aware of my own breathing and tried to make it quieter. Something stepped away from the trailer. The gravel shifted once, then again, and then nothing. After maybe 30 seconds, Dana moved toward the small rear window. I caught her sleeve. "Don't!" She pulled free and lifted 1 corner of the curtain. Her entire body went still. I could not see her expression, only the outline of her head against the glass. Then she dropped so quickly that her shoulder struck the workbench. "What did you see?" She pointed toward the tents, but did not answer immediately. Finally, she whispered, "Someone's standing out there." "Someone?" "I don't know." She said the figure was upright and much taller than a normal person. Its shoulders looked narrow. Its arms seemed to hang unusually low beside its body. She could not describe the head. The fog distorted its outline, and a hemlock branch crossed behind it. She could not tell whether the head was tilted forward, covered by something, or simply shaped wrong. I did not believe her, or I did not want to believe her. Then something crossed in front of the trailer. I saw it through the front window. It moved between Rick's F-250 and the tree line, maybe 30 feet away. The fog concealed most of its body, but its shoulders rose above the roof of the truck. It took 3 slow steps on 2 legs. With each step, the body dipped lower than I expected, then rose again. It stopped beside the old brick chimney. For 1 second, it turned toward the trailer. I saw no face, only 2 small reflections, too high above the ground to belong to a deer, and too close together to look like a bear standing on its hind legs. Then the figure moved behind the chimney. It did not come out the other side. Dana crawled beside me and gripped my arm. She had seen it too. I locked the trailer door and pushed a metal toolbox in front of it. For the next 2 hours, nothing touched the trailer. Nothing crossed the windows. That should have made us feel safer. It did not. Around 11:30, the radio crackled. A man's voice came through the speaker. It was distant and distorted, but I thought it said my name. "Matt!" I grabbed the radio. "Rick!" Static. Then the voice returned. "Come outside." The tone was close to Rick's, but the words were too slow, too careful. It sounded like someone repeating a sentence in a language they did not understand. Dana reached over and switched the radio off. The voice stopped immediately. Neither of us suggested turning it back on. We did not sleep. Sometime after 2 in the morning, the fog began to thin. Just before dawn, 1 final whistle came from high on the ridge. 3 short notes. No long note followed. When there was enough light to see, we opened the door. The nearest tent had partly collapsed. One of its guide lines had been pulled loose, and the metal stake lay several feet away. 5 fresh scratches marked the side of the trailer. The highest began a little more than 7 feet above the ground. Behind the trailer, the mud had been disturbed by several tracks. Most were softened by the rain. Some looked almost like boot prints. Others were too long and narrow, with no clear heel, no clear toes, and no pattern I recognized. A line of them crossed the clearing toward the brick chimney. The ground around the chimney was covered in hard gravel, so we could not see where they continued. Dana photographed everything. Then we checked the digital game camera at the northern edge of the clearing. It had taken 3 pictures during the night. The first showed an empty clearing at 9:42. The second was almost completely black, as though something had passed very close to the lens. The third showed part of Rick's truck and a tall shape near the brick chimney. The image was blurred. There was no visible face, no clear outline of the head, no detail that could tell us what we were looking at. But the shape was upright. Rick and Luis returned shortly after 8. A tree had fallen across the access road the night before. At first light, a county road crew cut away enough of the trunk for them to pass. Rick initially thought a bear had entered camp. Then he saw the scratches. Dana and I told him what had happened separately. We agreed on the details that mattered: the whistle, the voice, and the tall figure beside the chimney. Rick listened without interrupting. When we finished, he looked at the nail inside the trailer. His orange whistle was gone. We searched the floor, the workbench, the equipment cases, and the ground outside. We never found it. That afternoon, we packed the camp and moved 3 miles south. Before leaving the county, we stopped at a diner near Webster Springs. Luis mentioned the whistle to an older man sitting alone at the counter. His name was Calvin Hodge. He had worked for the utility company for more than 30 years. Calvin asked where we had camped. Rick told him. The old man stopped stirring his coffee. "By the chimney?" Rick nodded. Calvin looked down at his cup for a long time. "My father worked that line before they closed the settlement," he finally said. "He carried a whistle, too. 3 short notes to call the crew back." Rick slowly turned toward me. I asked Calvin what had happened to his father. Nothing he'd talk about. The old man lifted his coffee. But after one night on Bell Ridge, he never used a whistle in the woods again. That was all he would tell us. The utility company eventually postponed the survey. Officially, the access road had become unsafe because of erosion. I never returned. For years, I kept Dana's game camera photograph in a folder on my computer. Every few months, I opened it and tried to convince myself that the shape was a tree, a shadow, or part of the old chimney. Then in 2017, Rick sent me a photograph without any explanation. A different crew had returned to Bell Ridge to inspect storm damage. They found an orange plastic whistle hanging from a branch above the old road. It was high enough that a man would have needed a ladder to put it there. The black cord was still attached, and scratched into the orange plastic were 3 short marks, followed by 1 long one.
Story 2. The Girl from Alder Run. Location, northern Wisconsin. Approximate year, 1997. The little girl I walked out of the woods had been dead for 42 years. I learned that the next morning, after the man in the house died. This happened in August of 1997, when I was 22 years old. At the time, I lived in Madison and worked behind the counter at a pharmacy, while deciding whether I wanted to go back to school. Near the end of that summer, I spent a week with my grandparents in northern Wisconsin. They lived several miles outside Mercer, in an old white house surrounded by state forest. There were only 6 other homes along their gravel road. Most of the land between them was covered with pine, birch, and black spruce. My grandparents had lived there since the early 1960s. They heated the house with wood, grew vegetables behind the garage, and still kept an old Ford pickup that my grandfather refused to replace. I had visited them every summer when I was a child. The area felt familiar to me. Not safe in the way a neighborhood feels safe, but known. I understood which trails led back to the road, which low areas became muddy after rain, and where my grandfather had placed strips of orange survey tape to mark the edge of their property. Late summer was berry season. My grandmother made jam every year, and on the second morning of my visit, she handed me a white plastic bucket and asked whether I wanted to gather wild blackberries. There was an old logging trail behind the house. The first quarter-mile was wide enough for a truck, but farther in, grass and young trees had grown through the tire tracks. My grandmother told me not to cross Alder Run. It was only a narrow creek during dry weather, but the banks were steep and covered with loose stones. "I know," I told her. "You said that when you were 14, too." "I didn't get lost when I was 14. You came back from the wrong direction. That's different." My grandfather laughed from the kitchen table. I left shortly after 9. The morning was warm, but the shade beneath the trees was cool. I wore jeans, an old University of Wisconsin sweatshirt, and hiking shoes that were already stained from previous trips. For the first hour, I stayed close to the logging trail. There were plenty of blackberry bushes, but most had already been picked clean by birds, bears, or other people. I found a few good patches and covered the bottom of the bucket. Then I noticed more berries farther downhill. I left the main trail and followed a deer path between the birches. That was the first mistake I made. It did not feel like a mistake at the time. I could still see the brighter strip of sky above the logging road behind me. The ground was dry. I knew the direction of my grandparents' house. The deeper I went, the more berries I found. By noon, the bucket was almost full. I sat on a fallen tree, drank water from a plastic bottle, and ate the sandwich my grandmother had packed. The forest was quiet, except for insects, and the occasional movement of branches overhead. I remember thinking I should turn back before the afternoon became too hot. I stood, picked up the bucket, and saw the girl. She was sitting beneath a hazel bush about 30 feet away. At first, I thought she was a pile of old clothing someone had dumped in the woods. Then she moved her head. She looked 7 or 8 years old. She was very thin. Her dress was faded blue with small white flowers. Over it, she wore a brown wool sweater with one button missing. Heavy gray stockings covered her legs. On her feet were dark lace-up boots, scratched and muddy around the soles. A yellow ribbon had been tied around her hair. Everything she wore looked old, not secondhand. Old in the way clothing looks in family photographs from another generation. I set down the bucket. "Hi." The girl watched me, but did not answer. "Are you okay?" "Nothing." I looked around for an adult. There were no voices, no backpacks, no sound of anyone moving nearby. "What's your name?" She continued staring at me. It was not the frightened look I expected from a lost child. Her eyes were open and focused on my face, but I had the uncomfortable impression that she was looking through me at something farther away. I moved closer. Are your parents nearby? Her lips parted slightly. Still no answer. For a moment, I wondered whether she had a developmental disability or was in shock. I crouched several feet from her. My name is Lauren. I'm staying with my grandparents near County Road J. At the mention of the road, her eyes changed. She looked directly at me. I got lost, she said. Her voice was quiet and flat. All right, we can fix that. I tried to smile. Do you know where you live? She nodded. Is it near the road? Another nod. Can you stand? The girl rose immediately. She moved so quickly that I shifted backward. Did you speak to Ruth? No. The girl went around the house. I heard the screen door. You should have knocked, my grandmother said. I know, but she said it was her home. My grandfather sat down on the porch step. The Bells don't have any grandchildren, he said. Maybe she was visiting. They don't have children living anywhere, my grandmother said. They had one daughter. My grandfather gave her a warning look, but she continued. Her name was Emily. She died when she was 8. I laughed once because the alternative was to take the statement seriously. That wasn't Emily. No, my grandmother said. Of course not. What happened to her? Neither of them answered immediately. Finally, my grandfather said Emily had disappeared in the woods in the summer of 1955. Harold had taken her berry picking near Alder Run. They became separated. He thought she had followed the path home, but when he returned, she was not there. Neighbors searched through the night. They found her body 2 days later, caught beneath a fallen tree downstream. The creek had risen after a storm. Harold never forgave himself, my grandmother said. That doesn't mean the girl I saw was Emily. No, she replied. But she would not look at me. The next morning, a pickup stopped outside my grandparents' house shortly after 7. It belonged to a neighbor from farther down the road. He told us Harold Bell had died during the night. Ruth had found him in his chair near the wood stove. The volunteer rescue squad came, but there was nothing they could do. My grandparents went to the Bell house that afternoon to bring food and offer condolences. I went with them. I told myself I wanted to see whether the girl was still there. The house smelled of coffee, wood smoke, and the casseroles people had begun delivering. Ruth Bell sat at the kitchen table. She looked exhausted and much older than she had from a distance. Several neighbors moved quietly through the rooms. I searched for signs of a child, a small coat, shoes near the door, a toy. There was nothing. When Ruth was alone for a moment, I sat beside her. I'm sorry about Harold. She thanked me. Then I asked the question I had been trying not to ask. Was a little girl here yesterday afternoon? Ruth stared at me. No. I walked a child to your gate. She went around the side of the house. No child came here. She said you were her mother. Ruth's hands tightened around a paper tissue. What did she look like? I described her. The blue flowered dress, the brown sweater, the gray stockings, the yellow ribbon. Ruth stopped breathing for several seconds. Then she pushed herself up from the table. Without saying anything, she walked into the living room. I followed her. A wooden cabinet stood against the far wall. On top were several framed photographs. Ruth picked up the smallest one. It showed a young couple standing outside the same farmhouse. Between them was a little girl. She wore a faded-looking blue dress with white flowers, a brown sweater, dark boots, and a yellow ribbon in her hair. It was the girl from the woods. I felt the edge of the cabinet press against my hip. That's her, I said. Ruth held the photograph against her chest. That was Emily. The picture had been taken in the spring of 1955, a few months before she died. Ruth asked exactly where I had found her. When I mentioned the hazel bushes and Alder Run, she closed her eyes. That's where Harold lost sight of her. My grandmother came into the room. She saw the photograph and understood immediately. Ruth began to cry. I expected her to say I was mistaken. Instead, she asked, "Did Emily come inside?" I heard the screen door. Ruth shook her head. That door hasn't closed properly in 20 years. It doesn't slam. No one spoke after that. On the walk home, my grandfather stayed several steps ahead of us. When we reached the gravel road, he finally said, "People used to tell stories about that girl." My grandmother told him to stop. But I asked what kind of stories. He said Emily had been seen twice after her death. Once outside the house before Ruth's mother died, and once near Harold's truck, the week his older brother was killed in a logging accident. "Do people think she causes it?" I asked. "No," my grandfather said. "I think she comes when someone is already leaving." "Then why did she need me?" He looked toward the trees. Maybe she didn't. That answer stayed with me. I returned to Madison 2 days later. Before leaving, I checked my berry bucket. It had been washed and placed upside down on the porch. Around the metal handle was a narrow yellow ribbon. My grandmother said she had not put it there. I untied it and placed it inside my wallet. For several weeks, I tried to convince myself that the girl had been a real child who happened to resemble Emily Bell. Maybe she had found the old clothes somewhere. Maybe the photograph had influenced my memory. Maybe the ribbon came from my grandmother's sewing basket. Then in November, my grandfather called. Ruth Bell had died in her sleep. She had survived Harold by less than 3 months. The evening before her death, a woman driving along the gravel road had seen a small girl standing inside the Bell's yard. The child was wearing a dark sweater and a light-colored ribbon in her hair. The woman slowed down because she thought the girl might run into the road, but the child walked around the side of the farmhouse and disappeared. The Bell house remained empty after that. It was sold several years later and eventually torn down. My grandparents moved south when my grandfather's health began to fail. I have not returned to that stretch of road since. I still have the yellow ribbon. The color has faded almost completely, but the fabric has never frayed. I do not know whether Emily came to take her parents away. I prefer to believe she came because she had spent 42 years trying to find her way home. And because, one afternoon in the woods, she finally found someone willing to walk with her.
Story 3. The Map from Wren Butte. Location: Willamette National Forest, Oregon. Approximate year: 2011. The old man showed me a trail that had been erased from every modern map. We followed it together shortly before sunrise. Less than an hour later, he disappeared from the path behind me, and a missing boy called for help from the bottom of the ravine. This happened in late October of 2011, when I was 36 years old. At the time, I worked as a field technician for a communications contractor outside Eugene, Oregon. My job was to maintain radio repeaters used by logging companies, utility crews, and occasionally the Forest Service. Most of the equipment sat on isolated ridges where cell phones were useless. I replaced batteries, tested antenna cables, and recorded voltage readings on forms that probably went straight into a filing cabinet. It was not exciting work, but I knew the woods. I knew how quickly the weather could change in the Cascades, and I knew the difference between being uncomfortable and being in real danger. I did not believe in ghosts. I did not believe in forest spirits. And I certainly did not believe that the wilderness cared whether a person found their way home. The job that changed my mind took me to an abandoned fire lookout called Wren Butte. The wooden tower had been closed since the 1970s, but a small communications shed still operated beside it. There was also a one-room service cabin near the tower. Our company had permission to use it during maintenance visits because storms sometimes made the access road impassable. A repeater at the site had begun losing power at night. I was sent to replace part of the battery bank and inspect the charging system. Wren Butte was about 20 miles east of Oak Ridge, followed by another 14 miles on Forest Service roads. I drove a dark green 1998 Chevrolet pickup with almost 200,000 miles on it. My dog, Blue, rode beside me. Blue was a 6-year-old Australian cattle dog mix. He was not aggressive, but very little escaped his attention. A squirrel outside my house could wake him from a dead sleep. If anyone approached the truck, Blue usually knew before I did. That afternoon, he slept with his head against the passenger door while rain moved across the windshield. The forecast had called for scattered showers. By the time I reached the mountain road, it was raining hard enough to turn the dust into mud. The lower section was maintained for logging trucks. The final 6 miles were narrow and deeply rutted. Alder branches scraped the sides of my pickup, and water ran through the tire tracks, carrying loose gravel downhill. I reached Wren Butte shortly before 3. The old lookout tower stood on a concrete foundation at the highest point of the ridge. Its boards had gone grey, and several of the lower steps had been removed to keep visitors from climbing it. The communications shed was no larger than a backyard storage building. Inside were 2 equipment racks, a charge controller, and 4 deep cycle batteries. I expected the repair to take 2 hours. It took almost 4. One of the battery terminals had corroded so badly that the bolt snapped when I tried to remove it. I had to drill it out, clean the cable, and install a new lug. While I worked, Blue wandered between the shed, the truck, and the cabin. At around 5:30, he stopped near the northern edge of the ridge. He stood completely still, ears forward, staring into the trees below. "What is it?" Blue looked back at me. Then he returned to the truck and climbed inside without being told. I walked to the edge of the slope. The forest dropped steeply into a narrow valley where Douglas fir and western hemlock disappeared into the mist. I saw nothing moving. For a few seconds, the rain weakened. Somewhere below the ridge, I heard a single metallic note. It was clear and distant, like someone striking an old steel pipe. I waited. The sound did not repeat. Logging crews had worked that country for more than a century. Old cable, machinery parts, and rusted signs were scattered throughout the forest. I assumed a falling branch had struck something metal. By 6:20, the repeater was working normally. I contacted our dispatcher from the truck and told her I was leaving the site. She warned me that a stronger storm cell was moving through the Cascades. "Try to reach pavement before 9, she said. "That's the plan." I packed my tools, loaded Blue into the truck, and started down the mountain. I made it less than 2 miles. A section of the road had collapsed. The outer edge had broken away, leaving a gap where half the road used to be. Mud and loose rock were still sliding into the trees below. There was not enough room to turn around. I backed uphill for almost a quarter mile before finding a wide spot near an abandoned spur road. By then, daylight was fading. I considered leaving the truck and walking around the washout, but I had no way of knowing whether the road below was still intact. The temperature was falling, and the rain was becoming heavier. So I returned to Wren Butte and decided to spend the night in the service cabin. Bad weather had forced me to sleep at work sites before. I had food, water, a sleeping bag, a first aid kit, and a small propane heater. The cabin had a solid roof. That was enough. Inside, there was a metal bunk, a small table, 2 chairs, and an old wood stove that had been disconnected years earlier. A narrow counter ran beneath the windows. In the sink sat an enamel coffee cup. It was white, with a dark green rim, and the bottom was stained brown from years of use. I set my sleeping bag on the bunk and started the heater. Blue lay beside the door. At around 7:40, I contacted dispatch again. The storm was creating heavy interference, but I managed to report the washout and explain that I would remain at the lookout until morning. The reply broke apart in static. Still, I heard enough to know the message had been received. I ate some beef stew, gave Blue his food, and made coffee in a small aluminum pot. Nothing unusual happened during the night. The wind struck the cabin in heavy waves, and rain rattled against the windows. A few times, Blue raised his head and listened, but he never barked. I slept badly. At 6:18 the next morning, my radio came alive beside the bunk. The dispatcher was calling my name. I sat up and answered. The storm had weakened, but the signal still faded every few seconds. A 14-year-old boy named Eli Grant had disappeared from Cold Creek Campground shortly before the worst of the rain. He had been wearing a yellow rain jacket and carrying a gray backpack. His parents believed he had gone for a short walk before dinner. He had not returned. Search and rescue teams were approaching from the west, but 2 road failures had blocked their vehicles. They were continuing on foot, although it would take them several hours to reach the drainage below Wren Butte. "Stay near the cabin," the dispatcher said. "Watch the north and east slopes. Call if you see smoke, movement, anything unusual." "I have a clear view from the ridge." "That's why I called you." The transmission broke apart. I tried to ask whether anyone was searching from the campground side, but the signal disappeared. I put on my boots and jacket. Outside, the rain had almost stopped. The sky beyond the eastern windows was beginning to turn from black to dark gray, but there was not yet enough light to see beneath the trees. Blue stood beside the door, watching me. Then someone knocked 3 times, not loudly, 3 slow taps against the wood. Blue looked at the door, but he did not bark. I picked up my flashlight. "Who is it?" A man answered from the other side. "The road's gone below the switchback." His voice was calm, older, local, from the sound of it. I opened the door. A tall man stood beneath the narrow porch roof. He appeared to be close to 70. He wore a dark green wool coat, brown work pants, and leather boots. The coat looked like an old Forest Service uniform, although there was no badge or name patch. His gray hair was combed straight back. The ground outside was soaked, but his boots were clean. So were his coat and hair. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked past me toward the coffee pot. "You still have some?" "Coffee?" He nodded. I stepped aside. "Come in." The old man entered. Blue moved away from the doorway, but he did not sniff the stranger or follow him with his eyes. Instead, the dog stared at the open porch behind him, as if he expected someone else to enter. I closed the door. The old man sat at the table. I poured coffee into the enamel cup from the sink and placed it before him. "You working around here?" I asked. "Not anymore." "What's your name?" "Cal." "Cal what?" He wrapped both hands around the hot cup. "Cal is enough up here." The radio crackled behind me. Cal looked toward it. "The boy from Cold Creek," he said. "They won't find him near the campground." I set down my own coffee. "You heard the call?" "Enough of it. Have you seen him?" "No." "Then how do you know where he went?" Cal reached inside his coat and removed a folded paper map. The paper was yellowed and soft along the creases. He opened it on the table. It showed Wren Butte, Cold Creek, and several old logging roads. A date was printed in one corner, 1958. 2 trails had been drawn leaving the northern side of Cold Creek campground. One curved west toward the main road. The other climbed east toward Wren Butte. There used to be 2 trails leaving that campground, Cal said. One brought people back to the road. He touched the eastern line. The other looked like it did. I leaned closer. The second trail did not appear on my GPS maps or on the modern Forest Service map in the truck. That route was closed before you were born, Cal continued. A slide took out the lower section, but the first part still looks clear enough to follow. And you think the boy took it? If he left the campground heading uphill, he may have. Why wouldn't the search teams know about it? Because people stopped putting it on maps. His answer was simple and practical. Exactly the kind of thing an old ranger or logger might know. I studied the pencil line. Where does it go? To an old fire break below a split cedar. After that, it crosses a ravine and climbs toward this ridge. He pointed to a faint line ending behind the cabin. I looked at the windows. The sky was growing lighter. Can you take me down there? Cal drank some coffee. Yes. I reached for the radio. The signal returned long enough for me to tell the dispatcher that a local man knew an abandoned trail connecting Wren Butte to Cold Creek. She told me not to enter the drainage alone. I won't be alone. Keep trying the radio. Mark your route if you can. Then the signal faded again. I packed water, food, my first aid kit, 2 wool blankets, and extra batteries for the radio. I considered bringing Blue, but the map showed a steep, unstable section near the ravine. A loose dog would make the descent more dangerous, and I did not know how the boy might react to him. I left Blue inside with food and water. He scratched once at the door when I closed it. Cal was waiting beside the old water tank. The first grey light had reached the ridge. Behind the tank, half hidden by salal and young fir trees, was the beginning of a trail. I'd walked past that tank several times the previous day. I had never noticed it. A shallow blaze had been cut into the first tree. The exposed wood looked pale, almost fresh. Cal entered the trail without hesitation. I followed him. The route descended in long switchbacks, avoiding the steepest ground. My GPS showed no trail. According to the screen, we were walking through unbroken forest. Cal moved slowly, but he never searched for the path. He seemed to know where every turn should be. In several places, the trail disappeared beneath fallen branches or thick salal. Cal would step through the brush, and the path would appear again beneath his boots. After about 30 minutes, I asked how long he had worked in the area. A while. At the lookout? He glanced back at me. A while there too. You know who closed this trail? Cal looked ahead. The mountain did most of the work. That ended the conversation. The slope grew steeper. The rain had loosened the ground, and twice I felt mud shift beneath my boots. Cal never slipped. As the light strengthened, I began to see broken branches along the trail. Then we reached 3 young fir trees leaning downhill. A strip of grey fabric was caught on one of them. I pulled it free. It was part of a backpack strap. A few yards farther on, we found the backpack itself, wedged against a root. One shoulder strap had torn away. The outer pocket was open, and several candy wrappers lay in the mud. Cal had not predicted that. He had only shown me the abandoned trail. The backpack told us the boy had used it. "Eli!" I shouted. No answer. Below the pack, the ground had collapsed along the edge of the path. Fresh mud sloped toward a narrow ravine, and branches had been broken in a line leading downward. "He went over here," I said. Cal stood beside a large cedar whose trunk divided about 6 feet above the ground, the split cedar from the map. I looked into the ravine. The bottom was still hidden by trees and mist. "We need to go down." Cal did not move. For the first time since leaving the cabin, he seemed tired, not out of breath, just tired. He looked along the trail behind us, then down into the ravine. "I've been walking from that cabin down this trail for what feels like an eternity," he said. His voice was quieter now, and somehow this route still won't let me reach the end. I stared at him. "What does that mean?" Cal nodded toward the broken slope. "Go ahead. Follow the branches." "You're coming?" "I'll catch up." I took several careful steps down the muddy incline. The first section was steep, but roots gave me enough to hold. After about 20 yards, I reached a narrow shelf above the ravine. I turned around. Cal was gone. The trail above me was empty. There was nowhere he could have hidden. The hillside was open between the trees, and I should have heard him walking away. "Cal?" Nothing answered. I climbed several steps back toward the trail. "Cal?" For a moment, I heard only water moving through the ravine. Then a weak voice rose from below. "Help!" I stopped. The voice came again. "Please!" I forgot about Cal and started down. Eli was lying beside a fallen cedar at the bottom of the ravine. His yellow jacket was covered in mud. One leg was trapped between 2 branches, and his left ankle had swollen badly inside his boot. He was wet, shaking, and barely able to speak. I freed his leg and wrapped him in one of the blankets. He told me he had followed a trail from the campground because he thought it curved back toward the road. When the storm began, he tried to return. The edge collapsed beneath him. He had lost his backpack during the fall and spent the night beneath the tree. "Did anyone else come down here?" I asked. Eli shook his head. "Did you see an older man? Green coat?" "No." I gave him water and checked the rest of his injuries. The ankle was probably broken, but I found no serious bleeding or obvious head injury. My radio worked from the ravine. The storm had moved east, and the signal was stronger. I gave dispatch our approximate position and described the abandoned trail. Search and Rescue instructed me to keep Eli warm and not attempt to move him up the slope alone. The first team reached us a little more than 2 hours later. They had come from the western side of the drainage and followed my radio signal for the final section. We carried Eli uphill in a rescue litter. When we reached the split cedar, I looked for Cal. There was no sign of him. One of the rescuers examined the trail. He had worked that district for 16 years. "I've never seen this route," he said. "It runs all the way to Wren Butte. Not on any current map. It was on an old one." I looked toward the place where Cal had been standing. The mud showed my boot prints and those of the rescuers. I could not find a single print belonging to him. We reached the ridge shortly before noon. A sheriff's vehicle had managed to approach from another access road, and Eli was taken to the hospital. His ankle was broken, and he was treated for mild hypothermia. He recovered. After everyone left, I returned to the cabin. Blue rushed to the door when I opened it. The room was empty. "Cal?" No answer. The enamel cup stood in the sink. It was clean and dry. The old map lay open on the table. At first, I thought I was looking at the wrong side. The pencil trail connecting Cold Creek to Wren Butte had disappeared. The campground was still there. The split cedar was still marked. The old logging roads remained. But the line we had followed was gone. It had not been erased. There were no smudges or damaged fibers on the paper. It was simply no longer there. I turned the map over. 2 sentences had been written on the back in dark pencil. The first said, "Daniel Miller listened, though he doubted." Beneath it was a second sentence. "I hope he never walks this trail twice." I did, and it has never let me leave. I read both lines several times. Then I went outside and called Cal's name from the porch. The forest gave me no answer. A week later, I visited the Ranger District office to complete my statement. I brought the map with me. A retired Forest Service employee named Marjorie Hale was helping organize old records that day. When she saw the map, she asked where I had found it. I told her that an older man named Cal had brought it to the cabin at Wren Butte. She became very still. What did he look like? I described the grey hair, the green wool coat, and the clean leather boots. Marjorie opened a filing cabinet and removed a thin folder. Inside was a black and white photograph of 3 Forest Service employees standing beside the Wren Butte Tower. The photograph had been taken in 1959. The tall man on the right had grey-streaked hair combed straight back. He was holding a white enamel cup with a dark green rim. His name was written on the back, Calvin Mercer. Marjorie told me Calvin had served as the Wren Butte lookout for 11 seasons. In November of 1964, 2 hunters were reported missing near Cold Creek during an early snowstorm. Calvin left the lookout before sunrise to search the abandoned Eastern Trail. The hunters eventually reached a logging road on their own. Calvin never returned. His radio and pack were found beside the split cedar. The ground below had collapsed into the ravine. His body was never recovered. I showed Marjorie the writing on the map. She read it without speaking, then she folded the map and handed it back to me. "Don't try to find that trail again," she said. "I wasn't planning to." That isn't always the same thing. I kept the map inside a plastic sleeve in my toolbox. The route never reappeared, but the paper remained deeply creased along the place where the pencil line had been. As though someone had folded and unfolded the same path for a very long time.